I seem to be a magnet for creeps and weirdos, and since I got such a positive response on my last experience, I figured I would share a few more with y'all. I'll be writing these in order of let's not meetness, so I guess skip to the end if you only want to hear the scariest. Background. These all took place outside my home at the time, which was on the literal last block of a major city, right across the street from the beach. The building was framed on 4 sides by the beach, the woods, a construction site, and a few other sleepy houses, as well as a Mooney line. Think the subway, but above ground. It's the very last stop on the Mooney, so unless you can catch it at the right time of day or at the height of a tourist season, the area is basically empty on the sidewalks. The house itself has an initial patio door, which doesn't always fully close if you don't slam it. Then an entry area with a staircase leading up to a second locked door that leads to the apartment. For experience 1, I get home from work one day at about 9 p.m. Immediately, I get into a small spat with my roommates. After about 30 minutes, I decided to leave the house to cool off for a bit. I had planned on sitting on the porch outside, but as I looked across the street at the ocean, I decided it might be more peaceful there. I had never been to the beach at night for safety reasons, but as I looked at the well-lit parking lot and no one in sight, I decided that this one time it might be alright. In the 1-block span from the beach to my home, there was a little wooded path that started on my street and dumped you out at the crosswalk for the beach. It also intersected with another pathway that took you right down to the coast. I sat for a bit. Everything was fine, and after a while, I started the around 1-minute walk back on the little path. All of a sudden, though, I look up and see a man walking briskly on the intersecting path, looking straight at me. I sped up a bit and tried to ignore him, and as we hit the intersection where the 2 paths connect, I end up being only about a foot away from him. He calls out to me, "Hey, you! I want to talk to you!" I ignore him, but after only a few more steps, he reaches out his hand and grabs my hair. "Hey, come here!" I immediately yanked my hair out of his hands, booked it to the last block, sprinting to my house, and I could hear him running behind me. I turned the corner sharply and was briefly out of his sight. Luckily, the initial entryway to the patio had been left open by accident, and I ran in through the front door and slammed it shut. I could hear his footsteps stop outside, followed by silence. As I go upstairs and look through our front window, I could see him walking away and disappearing into the construction site. Experience 2. I had a friend that lived a couple of blocks from where I was, along the same stretch of beach. After hanging out one day, I decided to head back home around sunset. I've walked this route many times, and it's just barely light outside still, only about a 5-minute walk, so I figured I'd be home before dark. As I crossed the intersection from their house, I noticed a white van parked on the corner that's not usually there, covering a little garden I like to look at on my way back. I could just barely make out 2 people in the front seat. I think to myself, odd, okay, whatever. I pull out my pepper spray. I cross the street, passing the van, and now have my back to it. As soon as my foot hits the pavement on the other side of the street, I hear the van start up. I turn my head just slightly and see them illegally turning onto the street where I'm now walking. They creep the van beside me slowly, just behind me but within my peripheral vision. I decided to stop and let them pass. I pause and pretend to be looking at my phone, but I see them stop driving immediately. This was a huge nope from me, and I broke into a run, the van following me, to a small vintage motel about 1 building away. I knew this building had an open entrance courtyard, and as I approached it, I turned quickly into the yard and run up to an archway entry for a unit. I stop at the first few steps, catching my breath, and I open my phone front camera to use as a sort of mirror to see what the van is doing. They had backed up to the entryway of the motel and sat there for a few minutes. Then the one on the passenger side opened the door and started walking towards the motel, his phone flashlight on. I immediately pulled my own phone back, listening for his footsteps and readying myself to start banging on the motel door, hoping someone was inside. I waited in silence for a long time, long enough for it to get completely dark. When I finally got the courage to look out again, both the man and the van were gone. I called an Uber to take me the last 2 blocks. Sorry, Uber driver. And after that, I never saw them again. Experience number 3. I have a friend over and we want to dab a bit, a form of smoking weed. It's about 10 p.m. My roommates don't like dabbing in the house because of the smell, so he and I go to his car parked out front. We're in there having a good time, when I notice this person walking down the block, pulling on car door handles. I notify my friend, and we watch as the same person comes up to his car and yanks on his back door. He honks his horn and they back up for a minute, then walk up to his driver window and knock on the window, making a motion to roll it down. Just as I'm about to tell him not to, he rolls down the window just a bit. The person was clean and normally clothed, and asks what day it is, then what time it is, to which my friend answers both. The person stands there and stares at us as he tries to usher them away, even offering the person money. Without saying anything though, they walk away down the block, and once they reach the intersection between the construction site and woods, they roll their head back up to the sky and just start screaming at the top of their lungs as they back away out of sight. I take this opportunity to dart back inside my house as my friend watches, making sure to close the patio door. A few hours later, one of my roommates comes home very drunk, and as we figured later, they failed to make sure the patio door shut all the way. Morning comes, and I wake up to an empty apartment. I open my phone and have a singular message from my roommate from 3 hours ago, stating that when they left for work this morning, there was a person they didn't know sleeping inside the patio area. They thought it was a drunk person who lived in the neighborhood and had entered the wrong house by mistake. Evidently, they didn't find enough of a reason to call me or wake me up. I immediately go to the entryway of our apartment, pulling the door open fast. To my surprise, the person who had been talking to us in the car the night before is just casually lying across my staircase, fiddling with something. I scream loudly, and they immediately hop up and run out of my patio door. I run down the stairs after them and open the door. They're standing across the street now, just smiling at me and giggling. They then give me a little wave and run off. I close the door hard and go back up the steps to see what they had left. Sitting on the steps were a few coins, some weird type of wire-like objects. Think a bobby pin after you bent it into a straight line, a lighter, and a pocket knife. I never saw that person again after that. Unrelated to my stories, but shortly after I moved from that area, a teenage girl was abducted from that same corner where I'd seen the van, and after a car chase, police found a severed head in the freezer of a house along my block as well. I also got a lot of questions regarding calling 911 on my last post, and wanted to clarify. I'm from a rural area, and have had many bad experiences with cops abusing power, and have been raised to always be wary of police. I've also had situations that were severe enough that I did need to call them, and they didn't help me at all. So that's not really a thought that goes through my head when dealing with these situations. I've learned how to take care of myself, or to utilize community resources for other types of situations. These all happened years ago, and it's pretty wild to look back on and remember just how terrified I felt in those times. So, there's my stories. Hope y'all enjoyed. Hey all. Before I start, I'd like to give a couple of details about me. At the time of this story, I had just finished my 6th grade year and was very athletic. I took runs just about every day. This encounter occurred in the summer, and what comes with summer? Heat. So instead of running in the day when it was hotter, I began to run in the evening when the sun was down lower. On the day of this encounter, I followed my normal routine. I told my mom I was going to start my run, and they began to listen to my music on my iPod Shuffle. The way my neighborhood works is that there's only one entrance which doubles as the only exit as well. I live in a suburban area, so the main road that passes the entrance on my neighborhood is not very busy at all, but it usually isn't completely empty either. On that day, I was running down the main road of my neighborhood that all of the small streets branch off of. I was close to the entrance and could clearly see all of the cars passing by. I was also clearly visible to them as well. I remember watching as this gray Honda slammed on its brakes at the entrance of my neighborhood. This was done so fast and hard, I could hear the tires squealing over the song I was listening to at full volume. I brushed it off as someone most likely following directions and nearly missing my neighborhood's entrance. The car then began to go up the road I was running on extremely slowly, at least 10 miles an hour under the speed limit. I could make out 3 shadows in the car through the darkness, and the little light from the house's porch lights, 2 at the front of the car, and someone else in the back seat. As I passed the car by, I saw the driver's side window was down. I gave the car a smile and a wave, and I turned down a small street that branched off the road I was running on. I remember at this point feeling extremely on edge, so I checked over my shoulder. I saw the car turn around in the middle of the road, then slowly turn down the street I was running on. Again, I chalked it up to misinterpreting directions, and tried not to think too much of it, but of course I began to really freak out. As a girl of my age, I would always jump to the worst possible conclusion. I wasn't very tall and only stood at about 5'2", so I knew that I could be easily manhandled if the people in the car had any ill intentions. I knew that was very unlikely though, so I tried to tell myself to calm down a bit. I reached the cul-de-sac at the end of the street, so I was now running on the opposite side of the car. They were still coasting along, very slow. What I did next may have saved my life, and I can't imagine what would have happened to me if I didn't. As the car and I were about to be right next to each other, I paused my music, but kept my earbuds in, giving the illusion that I was still listening. As the car and I got closer, I could hear the 2 men speaking amongst each other. One of them actually tried to speak to me, yelling out, "Hey," or something like that. I didn't reply because I knew that it would blow my cover, and they would know that I was able to hear them. As the car drove a bit behind me and out of view, I could barely hear one of them say, "We'll get her when we turn around." I froze. Get me? I felt like someone dumped a bucket of freezing water on my head. I knew they had to go around the cul-de-sac still, so I did the only thing I could think of. I sprinted. As I ran down the street, I looked over my shoulder and saw the car had already gone around the cul-de-sac and was now going a lot faster after me. I turned into the main road of my neighborhood and ran as fast as I could. I passed my street and just ran as fast as possible towards the end of my neighborhood. My house was the first on my street, so I knew they would see where I lived if I tried to go home. I was scared to death and running for my life. I had no idea what I could do to get away from these people, so I just pushed my body as hard as possible. I continued to check over my shoulder, hoping they maybe wouldn't be there, but they always were. They were right behind me, and I distinctly remember they were dead silent. I'd imagined them yelling at each other that I was going to get away, but instead they were chasing me in complete silence. To me, that was even creepier than if they were yelling. When I ran down the last street in my neighborhood, I started to run through backyards. That was the only thing I had left to do. I heard the car slam on its brakes, turn off its engine, and 3 doors slam. My heartbeat sped up. I was so convinced they were going to begin chasing after me through the backyards. "Get back in the car. We won't find her like this." My heart dropped as I heard 3 doors shut and the car engine start up again. Now that I had started running through backyards, I would have to run across the streets too. This was the scariest part for me, because I would be very visible to the people in the car if they would be driving down the main road. I remember staring at the street, trying to decide whether or not I should just wait it out, or if I should book it home. I went with the second option. I didn't even check my shoulder as I ran through backyards, jumped over fences, and ran across the streets. I was just waiting for car lights to light up the area around me, or for arms to wrap around me, but thankfully it never happened. Somehow the car must have turned down the wrong street, or completely missed me, and I truly believe that's the luckiest thing that's ever happened to me. When I got to my house, I wasted no time jumping through the front door. Once I slammed it shut, I sat on the ground and thought about what had just happened, and what could have happened as well. I never ended up telling my parents until years later, and I didn't call the police either. But if they are still out there, I hope they're locked up somewhere so they can't terrorize a child again. I can't imagine what they would have done to me if they ever caught me. This all happened about 2 years ago, when I was 25. I'm female as well. It's a long story, but background and context is important. I used to work overnight shift in a hotel. It was a cruisy job. I worked alone, and after my audit was finished, the rest of my night was free to Netflix and occasionally do the university work I intended to do. I only lived a 6-minute walk from the hotel, and often used my 1 a.m. break to walk back home and grab dinner or a phone charger I'd forgotten. I know, not the smartest idea, but I'd been doing this walk home and back at 1 a.m. for years without issue, until this night. At 10 p.m. I would walk to work. I wouldn't describe the street I walked down as sketchy or dangerous by any means, although there was one house I passed on this walk, which I knew some dodgy characters resided in. After a while, I figured from the amount of people who would park outside the house for only a few minutes, then return, that they were likely drug dealers. So on this particular night, I left from my walk to work at 10 p.m. and noticed the dodgy drug dealer's house surrounded by a number of police. I thought nothing of it, just figured they had been caught for their activities and continued to walk to work. At 1 a.m. on my break, I headed off for my usual walk home to grab dinner. I was a little curious as to what had happened with the drug house, so I glanced at the house a few times on the way past to see if anything seemed out of place. It didn't, but unbeknownst to me, this glance was a huge mistake. After dinner at home, I started on my walk back to the hotel. As I walked down the one long road ending at the hotel, a car began to drive erratically next to me. First, they slowed right down and passed me, then suddenly hit the brakes and jerked the steering into the gutter as if to park, before speeding up again, repeating this twice just ahead of me. Eventually, the car comes to a complete stop about 100 meters ahead of me, on the opposite side of the road to which I'm walking. The driver got out and crossed the road to stand directly in my path, whilst the front passenger got out, rounded the back of the car, and opened the back door on the driver's side, and just stands next to the open door. Hell fucking no. Absolutely not was I going to continue walking towards that setup. I turn around and start walking back in the direction I had come, before the driver starts to call out to me. "Come back. Where are you going?" His calls got angrier and more aggressive, so I took off at a sprint back in the direction I came, aiming to take a right down a street separating the 2 blocks of straight road that would take me back to the hotel. I rounded the first corner just as I heard the car doors slam and the tires screech. I rounded the second right, slipping on the grass, running faster than I ever think I have. I could see the hotel, only 1 more block to sprint, but halfway, it was too late. I heard the car roar up beside me, a massive stitch in my side, and had no choice but to slow to a walk and initiate Plan B, talk fast. It was a man driving, shirtless and skinny as a rake. I still remember the matted, long black dreads and almost completely black eyes. A woman sat in the passenger seat, same skinny, drawn look on her face, covered in scabs with pinpricks for pupils. Fantastic. Meth heads. They were both yelling at me, demanding to know what I was doing walking at night. "I work at the hotel and just went home for dinner. Leave me alone." They persisted though, getting more aggressive with the yelling. Suddenly, the woman jumps out of the car, runs in front of it to get in my face, almost getting run over by her boyfriend in the process. She starts screaming in my face that I'm a liar. What am I really doing? Meanwhile, the man takes the car down an alleyway just next to where they had caught up to me. He got out of the car and started calling down the alleyway to come there. She was completely erratic now, demanding to know the truth as to why I'm walking this late at night. I'm freaking the fuck out, trying to figure out what the hell is going on, when the woman says, "I know you're lying. Why are you walking? Some shit went down here tonight." I began to connect the dots. The drug house, the police earlier that night, my second glance towards the place. 2 meth heads. "I know," I told the woman, taking her completely off guard. "Like I told you, I walked to and from my work. I saw the police all around the house at 10 p.m. Finally, she sees reason. "Our house was run through with guns earlier tonight. You seemed suspicious when you walked past and were taking a second glance," she tells me. "It all makes sense. These crazy meth heads think I'm involved with the people that robbed their house." Meanwhile, though, the man had heard none of this exchange and was storming back down the alleyway towards me. He was quite angry. He pushed his girlfriend aside while she tried to explain the situation and started on forcefully and verbally interrogating me. Too bad, though, that he didn't believe my story. The next minute, he takes a hammer out of his pocket, holding it menacingly between us. He asks again, "Why were you out walking?" I tried to explain once more, but he was only getting more and more angry. He turned around and handed the hammer to his girlfriend before pulling a handgun from his bum bag and asking me yet again, why was I out here? I began to explain once more, a little more desperate this time for good fucking reason. I hadn't even got out a few words before the woman completely freaked out at the man for pulling the gun and got in his face telling him to put it away. In amongst all the chaos, I took my opportunity. I wasn't asking permission before I turned and sprinted the rest of the half block to the hotel, leaving the 2 meth heads mid-domestic. After I got back, I had a smoke, or 3, and processed what the fuck just happened. The realization dawned on me. The man's intentions, had I continued to walk towards the open back car door, would have been to abduct and potentially torture information I didn't have out of me with a hammer, all down to wrong place, wrong time scenario. It still kinda gives me chills when I think about the what-ifs.